Listen for words of faith in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 9. God said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and the home of your parents, and go to a place I will show you. I will make of you a great people. I will bless you and make your name so great that it will be used in blessings. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And all the people on the face of the earth will be blessed through you." Abram, who was 75 years old when he left Haran, began the journey as God had instructed, and his nephew Lot went with them. Abram took Sarai, his spouse, Lot, all their possessions, and all the dependents they acquired in Haran, and set out for Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan, Abram and his family travelled through the land until they arrived at the sacred place at Shechem and came to the oak grove of Moreh. The Canaanites occupied the land at that time. God appeared to Abram and said, "I will give this land to your descendants." Abram built an altar where God appeared to him. Then they moved off toward the hill country east of Bethel and set up camp, with Bethel towards the sea and Ai to the east. Abram built an altar to God and invoked the name of the Lord. After that, they travelled in stages towards the Negev. For foundational stories of faith, thanks be to God.
Our reading today comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9. Now, the word laughter, laughing, and its cognates are very rare in the Gospels. Today is an instance where the words are used, or one of them. The word for laugh in Greek is gallio, which is close like in sounding to Galilee, so it's easy to remember. So only 4 instances in the Gospels of the word laughter. And here you'll hear the people laughing at Jesus. Well, Jesus has been laughed at for 2,500 years, and ergo, we are laughed at as well. Here's the reading. As Jesus walked on, he saw Matthew, a tax collector, at his post. Jesus approached and said, "Follow me." Matthew got up and followed. Now, it happened that while Jesus was at table in Matthew's house, tax collectors and notorious sinners came to join Jesus and the disciples at the dinner. The Pharisees observed this and complained to the disciples, saying, "What reason can the teacher have for eating with tax collectors and sinners?" Overhearing the remark, Jesus said, "People who are in good health don't need a doctor. Go and learn the meaning of these words. I desire compassion, not sacrifices. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." As Jesus was speaking, a synagogue official came up to him and knelt down before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but if you come and lay your hands on her, she will live." Jesus got up and went with the official, and so did the disciples. As they were going along, a woman who had suffered hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the hem of his cloak. She was saying to herself, "If only I can touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turned around and said, "Courage, daughter. Your faith has healed you." At that moment, the woman was healed. When Jesus arrived at the house of the synagogue official, a noisy crowd had gathered, and the flute players, who were also the mourners, had already arrived. And when Jesus saw them, he said to them, "Get out." The child is not dead, but asleep. And they laughed at him. After the crowd had been put out, he entered and took the girl by the hand, and she got up. And the news spread throughout the countryside. For the power of transformation in Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God.
May I speak and may we all reflect in the name of God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Last year, the TV show SBS Insight told some of the diverse personal stories of faith, loss of faith, and changing patterns of faith in contemporary Australia. One that struck me was of a young Croatian Australian woman who had committed her life to God through a faithful adherence to Islam, including covering her head and body in conservative traditional dress. In doing so, she has found a profound sense of peace and flourishing. But some significant resistance has come her way. She experiences some of the continuing Islamophobia within parts of our society, and in addition, strong extra kickback from some white Australians, not least fellow Croatians, for what some would say is a nice, white, Western, and well-educated young woman taking up such a religious path. Is this not also, some would say, a betrayal of her family and her culture too? After all, religiously speaking Croatians are almost exclusively Christian, and in particular Catholic. So what on earth is this young woman doing? What is happening? I think we might say something of the stories in our lectionary this morning, each of which involves a breaking with powerful expectations of how those people are supposed to behave. And it involves a profound response to needs of salvation and a longing for God, which are simply not met by their conventional culture and practice. So Abraham and Sarah, Matthew, the synagogue official, and not least the hemorrhaging woman, all of whom are key characters in our gospel today, each challenge us. They invite us, I think, to reflect on what is stirring up in our own hearts. What is the longing that we have? What is bleeding, as it were, in our own lives, hearts and souls? What do we need to reach out to God for ourselves? For what are our needs that require transformation? What salvation do we seek? And what of God is calling to us? What is this path that we need to be opened up for us? Now, we have to admit that there's some special organising of the texts in the lectionary readings today. In particular, it's arguable whether the passage about the two females who are healed in today's gospel really sit best with the story of the call of the tax collector Matthew. Indeed, they've had to miss out a few verses between the Matthew passage and the other passage in order to make that link. But as some commentators have suggested, the healing of the two females actually might be better linked to the healing of two males in the verses which immediately follow their stories. So this places emphasis, I think, on the healing and salvation to be found in Christ, rather than the call of God and the call of Christ, which is why we've got the Abraham link. But those two themes are intimately linked, I think. So as we journey on, as I said earlier, in the Christian year, we've had the great feast of Pentecost, we've had Trinity Sunday last Sunday. It is understandable that we are invited to consider what is the call of God to each of us now and to us together. What is the call of God to us afresh? And what does it mean to us? So, in those stories we've heard, you may or may not variously identify with Abraham and Sarah, refugees, migrants, as it were, who are called for various needs to move into another space with all the risks that happens. Or you might identify with Matthew, or the women, or the synagogue official, the father in our stories today. Or maybe you identify with none of those people. But whether we do or not, we are prompted today in our Christian year to be invited into reflecting on our spiritual needs and how we relate to God in them. I want to focus especially today on the hemorrhaging woman. Next week, we'll hear more of Abraham and Sarah's story, and indeed the following week. And we'll explore that further. It has many dimensions. It is certainly foundational to our faith today, which is why, in a sense, we begin this period of the year with this Abraham and Sarah story, and why we reflect upon it. But I think the hemorrhaging woman who slips a little bit through the net in Matthew's Gospel is also deeply emblematic of saving faith, even if she typically has less prominence than Abraham and Sarah. And that's one reason, I think, alongside patriarchal bias, why she's nameless. Not just because men weren't terribly interested in the woman's name. Maybe the church didn't know much about her after she'd been healed or whatever. It's also because she doesn't need a name, because in a sense she's each of us, or a lot of us, I think. Because in a sense she stands for us all, or at least those who bear great burdens and come to know their need of God and respond to this call, this invitation to life through the power of God. If you want a fuller account of the hemorrhaging woman, we obviously have to look at Mark's Gospel, from which Matthew took this story. Indeed, Matthew's Gospel gives us a text which is radically shorter than Mark's, because he has other interests. The role of Jesus, too, is somewhat heightened in this story that we've had. It's less prominent in Mark, and Luke takes his own version. But Matthew's Gospel retains key elements of strong need and healing through faith. It's obviously very powerful in all the communities from which the Gospels arose. And Matthew's Gospel also keeps this significant twinning of the story with that of the healing of the young girl. So we've got one of these females who's on the verge of puberty, coming in, as it were, into the full flow of her womanhood, but she's in the throes of death. Indeed, she dies in Matthew's Gospel completely. It's slightly different in Mark. The other is a mature woman, closer to death, especially in the face of seemingly unchangeable debilitation. But from her body flows this constant flow of blood, which is a sign of life and renewal as well. So we have life and death posed in this, young and old. The girl is 12 years old. The woman has borne her suffering for 12 years. Because 12 is a very powerful thing, isn't it? Think of the 12 tribes of Israel. Think of the 12 that Jesus chose. It's one of those powerful symbolic spiritual numbers. So this story actually has powerful symbolic spiritual significance you can reflect on that level as well. Because 12 reflects holy community and connection, which both of the females here lack. The blood of the hemorrhaging woman is not at all insignificant, because spiritually speaking, of course, blood has deep ambiguity, not least in ritual, in liturgy and theology and life. On the one hand, blood that flows is regarded as giving life force and energy. You think of all the songs and everything else around the blood of Jesus, for example. It's a sign of covenant, a reconciliation sacrifice, a power of love and life, indeed almost a seed to the soul. But on the other hand, those who are stained with blood can be excluded from sacred actions and sacred places, women and men who've done certain things. Blood, spirituality, and women, of course, have particularly complex relationships. Because blood flow through menstruation, which I think we are partly meant to think of here, especially with the young girl and the woman, blood flow in women's lives has been regarded rightly as life-giving and indeed deeply mysterious in many ways, but also as problematic, painful, restrictive, or a reason for restrictions. So such associations have, of course, historically contributed to the exclusion of women from functioning in certain spheres. Indeed, today, still, I think it underlies some of the exclusion of women in some male-dominated religious and other spaces. So you've got this ambivalent understanding of blood, on the one hand as pure and redeeming, and on the other as impure and unclean. And that's a duality, I think, maybe we live with it ourselves and in our space, in many spaces, even in the Western world today. Impurity and uncleanliness are thus often mentioned when blood is related to women's physicality. But if we're truly to affirm God as fully enfleshed, as fully human, not just male, we have to celebrate God in such female physicality. And so all of women's lives and physicality is also part of God's life. And that's part of what I think is there in the Gospels, even though we've sometimes struggled with that. Now, such considerations have in the past led some feminist scholars to see this story of the hemorrhaging woman as a critique of the ancient purity laws. Marla Selvich, for example, argued that the religious law of Jesus' world doubly marginalized the hemorrhaging woman, both as a woman and as impure. By allowing her to touch him, Jesus could then, she argued, be seen a little bit like a liberal egalitarian who is going against the purity laws to promote a more compassionate view as opposed to social exclusion based on purity or gender. Well, that's quite a convenient reading, I think, for modern progressives. But actually, it doesn't really stand up when you look at the experience of what women's experience and of the ritual laws of the day entirely. You have to nuance it, because otherwise you get into a situation where you say the religion of Jesus' day and the Jews that follow it are all so harsh, have bound up with purity laws. It's actually far more complex when you look at the experience of women's lives, when you read what the rabbis said, when you look at what the law said, which actually tried to operate far more nuanced. So you have dangers if you go too far with that, as what I'm saying is ending up with a sort of anti-Jewish interpretation. So other feminist scholars have indeed gone so far as to dismiss entirely this idea that this story is about impurity. And they point out the complexity of Levitical law on which the purity code is based from the book of Leviticus, and of rabbinical teaching and its application in Jesus' day. Big fights over these things, as we know. Pharisees, scribes, and everyone else, it's up for grabs. The significance of the hemorrhaging woman, therefore, lies, I think, between, don't ditch the understand, I think it's there, the blood and the impurity stuff, but it's not quite as straightforward as, a modern progressive reading would have it. The key element is surely the ill health of the woman, not the purity laws themselves. I mean, that might be an added factor. This is the heart of her distress. But her specific bleeding isn't incidental, because as a result of this blood condition, which is the main thing, she was ritually impure and she fell under certain restrictions of the time, explaining why when she reaches out to Jesus, she reaches out to touch the hem of his garment. Because if she touches the garment, it still affects his sort of status himself. But if she touched his body, then he himself would be made much more clearly impure himself. Similar purity restrictions, we have to be clear, were also applied to men. And so a lot of these, and those who've read through this, say the hemorrhaging woman may well have actually only needed to have waited to nightfall and washed, and then, but of course the blood flow kept coming back, so in effect she was in this perpetual state. For her story has specific ramifications, what I'm saying, for the spiritual value of women, not least in those features of women's physicality and experience which are proper to them. Because as the several different types of persons healed in the Gospels attest, that's why we've got a whole variety of them, the message for us is that whoever we are, salvation in Christ is offered to us, whoever we are. Even if we're the lowest of the low, even if we've got conditions that seem, no one wants to go near us for all kinds of different reasons. All of us, every single one of us, whatever gender, anything else we are. Whatever our need and longing. And that, I think, is another aspect of this twinning of the woman's story with that of the synagogue official's daughter and the subsequent healings in Matthew's Gospel of the two blind men. He's trying to say this is a salvation in God for every single person on the planet, whoever you are. So whilst paying attention to, as I say, some feminist implication of this story, we do well to attend primarily to this movement, and it is a movement of the woman's faith. Pilgrims on the Way, Uniting Church calls itself, doesn't it? In a sense, it picks up this, and you've got that, Abraham and Sarah. You've got the woman who's on the move. The synagogue official has to move. Matthew has to move. To live and to experience the salvation of God, we have to respond, we have to move. So we see a profound invitation to us in this touching, reaching out of the woman to touch the hem of Jesus' garment. She has to go quite a long way to fight her way through the crowd and avoid all the social stigma and everything else in order to do that. It is a powerful, powerful, determined act to do. Because out of her deep need, this woman is taking the courage to cross the boundaries of what people expect of her. Indeed, even religious expectations, trusting that such risk may bring new life. And she did not know, she did not know whether Jesus would also condemn her or people would take her away before she got to Jesus. That's what faith is. It's not a matter of belief in the sense of, I believe a proposition about God. It is this sense of movement and going forward and risking in the power of love, in the belief that love will respond to you. This has its complement in the synagogue officials reaching out beyond the social conventions expected. He's a person of great standing, church council chair in this place, and goes out to ask some riffraff preacher on the side for help instead of asking people in the synagogue or in the Uniting Church, going to the person that's there, might be an Islamic preacher or someone, in order for have that help for their child. So in the two cases, the woman's case, she's driven by her years of personal pain, which all these experts haven't been able to address. And in the synagogue officials, he's driven by a desperate love for his child. We can identify with those situations, can't we? Because faced by such existential challenges, nothing else matters. That's what can break us through into the love of God, by letting go. Not shame, nor society's approval, nor reputation, nor ritual expectation, nor the threat of punishment should keep us from God. Take that risk in love, because that is where we find salvation, we find the love and life of God. As we reflect next week, this reaching out for love, as I say, is the story of Judeo-Christian faith from Abraham and Sarah onwards. This constant reaching out, pilgrims on the way, as it were. Because just as Abraham and Sarah stepped out in faith, desperate for a new life in their own place of desolation, owning their own deep needs and longings. So it is with a hemorrhaging woman and a synagogue official, and so too for us all. We can continue to bleed in our hearts and souls, if not our bodies. We can stand by whilst our deepest hopes and our own hearts and souls descend into death. Or we can reach out beyond conventional worldly and religious expectations to the living God. Now, I was brought up when I was young with Bob Dylan. He put it well in a famous line in his song. And I think the hemorrhaging woman could have written that song. It's called, "It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding." He said, "Whoever is not busy being born is busy dying." We're back to the blood, yeah? Life and death here in these things, the choice. As Dylan wrote and sang, and the hemorrhaging woman knew so well, life in this world can be truly hard, with much false hope and disillusionment. But in risking life, in reaching out to touch the hem of the divine garment, we can be born again. And being born again is a constant process. It's not just a once and for all act. Blood then symbolizes in this story the possibility of new life, not just a draining away into death. So to conclude, what's it to be for you and me? Are we busy being born, or are we busy dying, whether we're young or whether we're old? What deep down needs and longings do we have which we're afraid to own? Will we reach out today to touch God's garment? Because that's what it takes to grow in the Christian faith, what the tradition calls being born again. Even in Matthew's Gospel's reduced version of the hemorrhaging woman's story, we see this truth, that it is in this movement of faith, this heartfelt prayer, this reaching out to love, that we fully experience God's love and will experience healing, maybe not quite the way we want sometimes. Or as Jesus puts it, in this, faith makes well. I like that. It reminds me of the father of the young Croatian-Australian woman I mentioned earlier. Like Jesus, this father, and I spoke with him at some length, could have taken umbrage at how his daughter had reached out unconventionally for deeper love and healing. After all, her action implicated him too. What she did affected him. But he didn't. He stands by her like Jesus, though he's still a faithful Catholic Croatian, because he knows that by our faith, by our acknowledging of our need and our reaching out in love, all of us find our salvation, our healing, and our true selves in the mystery of God who works in mysterious ways. For God works in those ways and seeks our transformation. So I'd like us to reflect just a little. I'm going to play a little piece of music so that we might, as we come to our prayers, to reflect on this story of the woman, the hemorrhaging woman told in song. And I'm doing so because the singer is Mary Clayton, an African-American soul and gospel singer, and it comes from her album Beautiful Scars. This was produced a few years after she'd recovered in her spirit and her soul, partly through her faith, from a terrible road accident which led to the amputation of both her legs. So she's in a similar situation, as it were, to the woman, in a sense, metaphorically. So this is a witness to the power of God, which saw her through that time, and also the strength of faith in the wider African-American community, from which, of course, soul and gospel arises, which has always reached out beyond its bleeding to God's new life. So whoever has ears to hear, let them hear.